In a lyrical passage near the end of The Great Gatsby, the narrator, Nick Carraway, muses on the Midwestern origins of all those involved in the novel's tragedy. I see now that it has been a story of the West. After all, we are all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life. As in most of his writings, F. Scott Fitzgerald is probably speaking of himself, since his life and art were marked by constant readjustments to a society that was never quite his own.
In olden days, a glimpse of stocking was a look on to something shocking, but now God knows anything goes. Good authors too, who once knew better words, now only use four-letter words, writing prose. Anything goes.
Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1896. The only son of an aristocratic father and rather provincial mother. Sometimes he thought of himself as heir to his father's traditions. He was named for a distant ancestor who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. And at other times, he felt himself to be the rough product of Irish immigration. Out of these mixed emotions came his ability to see both the glamour and the seaminess of American life. Fitzgerald came from a Catholic background and, like James Joyce, never lost a sense of some innate depravity lurking under the surface of life. He finished his secondary education at the Newman School in northern New Jersey, and then entered Princeton. Princeton was always for him a romantic setting, a place of social elegance and impossible dreams. No American writer has ever been more deeply influenced by university life.
Scott arrived at Princeton with the greatest of awe and respect. I mean, it was his big trip east, and the spires and gargoyles that he puts into this side of paradise were symbols of just being in the cathedral of learning for him. It evoked great romance. It was further south than he'd ever lived, and he took to it immediately.
For Fitzgerald, the university rose like a green phoenix out of the flat Midlands of New Jersey. Suddenly, all around you spreads out the loveliest riot of Gothic architecture in America. Battlement linked on to battlement, hall to hall, arch broken, vine covered, luxuriant and lovely. At Princeton, Scott first dreamed of success at football, then the most prestigious of extracurricular activities. Even Princeton's neo-Gothic architecture reflected this fascination with football and its gargoyles. But he was too slight for the team and turned his attention to college dramatics. He became an important figure in the Triangle Club, which gave him access to some of the most socially prominent men on campus. The Triangle Club had been founded in 1893 by Booth Tarkington, another Midwestern writer whose humorous stories, such as Penrod, were immensely popular in Fitzgerald's time. Every Christmas vacation, the Triangle Club would make a triumphant tour of major cities on the East Coast and in the Midwest, where the stars of the show were treated as heroes. The famous kick line of undergraduate men dressed as women became the signature of Triangle. During Fitzgerald's years at Princeton, the eating clubs on Prospect Street were the center of upper-class social life. He would later describe Ivy, detached and breathlessly aristocratic. Cottage, an impressive melange of brilliant adventurers and well-dressed philanderers. Tiger Inn, broad-shouldered and athletic. And Cap and Gown, anti-alcoholic, faintly religious, and politically powerful. In his sophomore year, he was elected to Cottage Club, which he considered one of the most desirable of the eating clubs.
We are here in the library of University Cottage Club, a replica of the 14th century library in Merton College, Oxford. And the very architecture of the club seems to reflect a split in Fitzgerald's undergraduate life. Here you have the library dedicated to study, to intellectual pursuits. The rest of the club is part of its social life, of course. If you think about Fitzgerald's life on the Princeton campus, it's evenly divided, really, between the life symbolized by the Triangle Club, his own eating club, the social life of the university, and on the other hand, his close friendship with Edmund Wilson, who would become the leading man of letters of his generation, his friendship with John Peel Bishop, the poet, and he sat at the feet of Christian Gauss, the famous Princeton teacher who introduced his students to the literature of France and of the continent in general. So Fitzgerald's life at Princeton was a double life, social on the one hand, intellectual on the other, and the two rubbed together from time to time.
In his frantic striving for social and literary prominence, he neglected his studies and never graduated.
I don't mind being all alone when I'm all alone.
In November 1917, Scott left Princeton to join the Army, and while stationed in Alabama, he met Zelda Sayre, the daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court judge. Zelda was interested in the arts, especially ballet, and longed to break out of her provincial world.
Lonesome. I don't mind being all alone when I'm all alone with you.
She had a number of suitors at the time, so he wasn't the only one, and it probably sharpened his interest somewhat. She was beautiful, she could dance, she was witty, and she did agree to marry him. They were engaged, but she broke off the engagement when she panicked a little bit about marrying a poor, unpublished writer.
Scott returned to St. Paul and rewrote a novel that he had begun at Princeton, This Side of Paradise, which was published in 1920, giving a foretaste of the coming jazz age. This Side of Paradise was, in spite of its immaturity, a great success. Fitzgerald was suddenly famous. He married Zelda, and they became living symbols of the jazz age. Ring Lardner called them the prince and princess of their generation. The publication of a second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, in 1922, put the seal on Fitzgerald's immense popularity. It is a novel about self-destruction, and possibly out of fear this might be their fate, Scott and Zelda moved to the Riviera in 1924, where they became part of a group of American expatriates who would today be called the Beautiful People. Later, in Paris, he would become friends with American writers such as Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway. When Hemingway first met Fitzgerald in Paris, Hemingway was still relatively unknown. It was Fitzgerald who recommended him to his editor at Charles Scribner's Sons, Maxwell Perkins. Perkins was to play a key role in both their lives as a personal friend and shrewd literary advisor.
Maxwell Perkins had a talent for encouraging and for major editorial suggestions. Scott himself was dyslexic to a certain degree and a really atrocious speller. Maxwell Perkins didn't spot mistakes like that. He wasn't that sort of editor.
In 1925, Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby, where his sensitivity to social nuances and moral scruples is brilliantly on display. It is the archetypal American novel of social ambition and the often tragic consequences of innocence betrayed. Whether The Paradise Lost is a Midwestern boyhood, or Paris in the early 1920s, or Gatsby's platonic ideal of Daisy, Fitzgerald is able to convey a moral idea through the interplay of delicate social forces. The novel has an elegiac atmosphere of lost grandeur and gaiety that foreshadows the rest of Fitzgerald's personal and artistic life. Through the use of a narrator, Nick Carraway, who is both involved in the action and detached from it, Fitzgerald gives us a double sense of the American dream.
And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning... So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. The countless escapades of the Fitzgeralds during the 1920s, such as their alleged plunge into the fountain of the Plaza Hotel in full evening dress, would soon become part of the decade's folklore.
There's been an awful lot of legend surrounding the Fitzgeralds and all their escapades, and it is hard to sort out definitively which is true, which stories are true and which aren't. I was in Alabama and met some friends of Zelda's, and they had been interviewed from time to time, and one of them told me that some stories had come up, had developed around Zelda's wildness and her jumping nude into a swimming pool, when in fact she had worn a flesh-colored bathing suit. Zelda would never have been quite that wild. And my mother felt that really to have fit in all the escapades that they've been attributed to them, there must have been 48 hours in a day.
The next decade of the Fitzgeralds' lives moved inevitably toward tragedy. Fitzgerald became an alcoholic, and Zelda, who had developed an obsessive desire to be a ballet dancer, had a series of mental breakdowns beginning in 1930. Finally, she had to be confined to a sanitarium. Perhaps the best evocation of the Fitzgeralds' life at this time is the superb story, Babylon Revisited, published in 1931. Set in Paris in the opening years of the Great Depression, the story traces a fine counterpoint between present-day reality and the lost illusions of the 1920s. Like Hemingway, Fitzgerald thought of Paris in the 1920s as a movable feast, a romantic image of life's possibilities. But the author and hero of Babylon Revisited know, at age 35, that Paris is simply a state of mind. What matters is not place or circumstance, but character. Charlie Wales, the story's central figure, believed in character. He wanted to jump back a whole generation and trust in character again as the eternally valuable element. At the end of the story, he realizes that he lost a lot in the crash, but more in the previous years of unthinking illusion. I lost everything I wanted in the boom. Again, the memory of those days swept over him like a nightmare. The people they had met traveling, the people who couldn't add a row of figures or speak a coherent sentence, the men who locked their wives out in the snow because the snow of 29 wasn't real snow. If you didn't want it to be snow, you just paid some money. It is this sense of destruction from within that separates Fitzgerald from the other writers of his time. Although often described as a chronicler of manners, Fitzgerald is at the deepest reaches a moral writer. His greatness lies in his power to evoke a profound feeling of lost opportunities and wasted talent.
My grandfather never really appreciated his gift for the short story. He knew he was capable of great ones, but felt that when he sold things to the Saturday Evening Post that he was really selling pulp fiction. Most of us today know they were great stories. It'd be interesting to know what he would have written if they had met his own personal standards, because now they're very accessible, easy to read, have wonderful plots, and it's amazing how he could turn a phrase. I think that Scott thought of himself as primarily a poet, and he appreciated poetry to an extraordinary extent. There were certain poems like Ode to a Nightingale that he read hundreds of times and that he read aloud to my mother, forced her to listen to it. And he did write a lot of poetry. It's not as good as his prose. He almost found his perfect medium because I think of him as having written poetic prose.
In the early 1930s, the Fitzgeralds retired to Zelda's home, Montgomery, Alabama, so that Scott could work on a new novel. But he had great trouble with the construction of Tender as the Night and did not finish it until 1934. It is the story of a man used up, a psychiatrist who marries one of his patients and then finds that she is feeding on his emotional and spiritual life.
Tender as the Night is one of the more admired of Fitzgerald's novels, and he worked on it for 7 years, and it was 9 years between the time he published The Great Gatsby and Tender as the Night appeared in the marketplace. And throughout that time he made many revisions and many drafts. Some he ripped up, one the Murphys saw him throw into the Mediterranean and thought he'd never write again.
Although not as technically accomplished as The Great Gatsby, Tender as the Night may be Fitzgerald's most personal and moving work. In its unfinished structure, the novel reflects Fitzgerald's fragmented life at that time. The critic Malcolm Cowley, who knew Fitzgerald very well, said there were really two Scott Fitzgeralds: the man inside the great house taking part in the glamorous party, and the man outside with his face pressed against the window pane. The wonder of The Great Gatsby is that the two Fitzgeralds come together in the figure of Nick Carraway, who is both a participant and a spectator. The problem in Tender as the Night is that the two never quite come together, and the novel is fractured right down the middle by this split in theme and in structure.
In spite of Zelda's illness, his persistent drinking, and a growing sense of failure, Fitzgerald soldiered on through the 1930s while his reputation rapidly declined. In 1937, he became a Hollywood scriptwriter, and there he met and fell in love with Sheila Graham, a columnist who wrote about the movie industry. During his years in Hollywood, Fitzgerald's daughter, Scotty, entered Vassar. He took an intense interest in Scotty's education and wrote her a number of letters giving advice about her reading and social life.
It's amazing how many letters he wrote and how he really did try to govern and engineer her life from California while she was going to Vassar in New York. By modern standards, they're pretty harsh letters. They're full of criticism and advice. My mother turned a deaf ear to them. She saw them as plain harassment. But Scott was clever because he divided her allowance into amounts of $13.50, which gave him an excuse to write her at least every week and make sure she'd open the envelope. And she admitted she would do that. She would open the envelope, remove the allowance, and stick them in a drawer.
In 1939, he began a novel about Hollywood, The Last Tycoon, which was never finished. What does remain for us shows that Fitzgerald could still write with power and conviction about innocence lost and the corruption of the American dream. As Fitzgerald's fame declined in the 1930s, the reputation of his old friend Hemingway reached dazzling heights, and their relationship became more problematic. In the first publication of Hemingway's story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, we find this cruel passage. He remembered poor old Scott Fitzgerald and his romantic awe of the rich, and how he had started a story that began, "The very rich are different from you and me," and how someone had said to Scott, "Yes, they have more money."
The someone is, of course, Hemingway, who clearly thought he'd got the best of the exchange. But in fact, it is an exchange that precisely defines the two writers. Hemingway is not interested in social distinctions and the nuances of manners. His style is suited to one man alone, on the battlefield or in the bull ring. It is a style that could never describe the world of Gatsby and Daisy. Fitzgerald, on the other hand, stands with Henry James and Edith Wharton as a master of the social scene where money and manners and social standing are the sources of action, the very fabric of reality, and the subject of moral judgments. Of all the American writers of his time, F. Scott Fitzgerald can now be seen as the greatest chronicler of the world Gatsby dreamed of but could never attain. The three great fiction writers of their generation, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Faulkner, were virtual contemporaries, born within the span of 3 years. Yet Faulkner was a latecomer to the writing of fiction in comparison to the other two. Some of the major early works of Hemingway and Fitzgerald were already in place when Faulkner began writing in the mid-1920s. And if you look at the early Faulkner works, especially Mosquitoes and Soldier's Pay, virtually every page can be annotated in the margin Fitzgerald. The influence is palpable and inescapable. When Fitzgerald died in 1940, his reputation was in eclipse. But since the 1960s, it has grown measurably. And today he seems to be one of the major models for writers of fiction of the current generation. I think his mastership of the moral scruples and the way in which one describes in minute detail a social scene, these make him a paradigm for anyone who wishes to write a novel of manners at the end of the 20th century.
F. Scott Fitzgerald died suddenly of a heart attack on December 21st, 1940, at the age of 44. When the seizure struck him, he was annotating an article about football in the Princeton Alumni Weekly.
That this heart and mind embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.